Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Authentic Engagement with People of Lived and Living Experience. I'm Elle Richards, Manager of Cities Reducing Poverty. I'm here today to introduce our speaker and moderator for this call, Cheryl Whiskeyjack and Jonathan Massamy. Cheryl proudly serves on the Canadian Accreditation Council of Human Services, Align Association of Community Services, End Poverty Edmonton, and the Stewardship Roundtable. She acts as a mentor for the Edmonton Chamber of Voluntary Organizations Executive Director Mentorship Program and represents Bent Arrow Traditional Healing Society, where she is the Executive Director, through several community partnerships. She is proud of the strong partnerships she has maintained across sectors and believes that ending poverty requires a diversity of voices to ensure better systems and communities for all of us. Cheryl has recently been named to the National Advisory Council on Poverty. Also joining us today is Jonathan Massamy. Jonathan is a supervisor of community centers with the city of Kitchener and is also a trained Anglican priest. Jonathan has worked in a variety of neighborhood settings and is a seasoned asset-based community development practitioner. His doctorate work, supervised by John McKnight, explored the relationship between ABCD and communities of faith. We'll first hand it over to Cheryl for her presentation before opening up to Jonathan for questions. Over to you, Cheryl.
All right. So good morning, everybody from Treaty 6 territory here in Edmonton, Alberta. I just want to share a bit about the organization I work for, which is the Bent Arrow Traditional Healing Society. So our mission statement, long and wordy as mission statements can be, is that Bent Arrow Traditional Healing Society is committed to building on the strengths of Aboriginal children, youth, and their families to enable them to grow, to develop spiritually, emotionally, physically, in all four realms, so that they can thrive in both the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. So our mission statement alone advocates, calls us to advocate and influence change. We quickly learned when we started the organization in 1994, and this isn't new learning, I'm sure everybody knows this, that our children, youth, and families aren't islands. So although our origins started in working with youth, we quickly learned that the folks around these youth were often also struggling. And so our organization grew out of building services around our folks that we're serving. We also know, and this is why we talk about living in two worlds, we know that a sense of belonging, connection to land, water, culture, teachings, ceremony is critical to adjusting to transition of any kind. It helps in the transition. I'm originally from Ontario myself. My family is from Manitoulin Island, and beautiful island. And my dad often used to say that we left because you can't live on scenery. So we came to Alberta for the opportunities that Alberta has to offer when I was just a young girl. And although I would say we were living in poverty, I would also say that I didn't really think that we were living in poverty. And the reason why is because we were very connected to our family, connected to our culture, and all of those things that I just mentioned are really important. And it allowed for us to have that sense of, create that sense of belonging here, even though we were far from home. The other thing that happened, and I don't know what was going on in the time because I was just a young girl, is that whatever supports were needed for our families to make that a good transition, they were in place. And this would have been in the early 80s. So every place we went to get support in helping us make that transition, they were there for my family, and we just didn't take us long to be able to start thriving in this city. So even though we came here with virtually nothing, it didn't take us long to be full participants in the city and the economy. So if we quickly learn that our folks that we're serving aren't islands, We also decided that Bentero couldn't be an island either. So we didn't want to be the place where people came and got support and felt connected and all of that kind of thing. We wanted to reach out to folks in the community that were also serving our children, youth, and families. So we, early days, very quickly started making partnerships with these organizations. One of them was the Edmonton City Police. Of course, our Indigenous community is really heavily involved in the justice system for all kinds of reasons. Child welfare was another system that we very quickly started to develop a relationship with because they were serving our community in large numbers as well. Edmonton Public Schools was educating our kids, and the City of Edmonton as a corporation was also looking to do a better job at engaging the Indigenous community. So we quickly developed partnerships with those people, and then eventually we started forming partnerships with the other organizations in and around Edmonton. I think Edmonton's a special place for all kinds of reasons, and now that I'm in this sector, in this nonprofit sector, one of the other things that I think is special is that our nonprofit sector is also pretty connected out here. So even though we are in competition with one another, we also want to help each other thrive. And so we have that really neat thing going on here where we support one another. And now that we are an organization, so started in '94, we have about 18 programs and services now. We have about 220 staff. We support other organizations in the work that they're doing, because we now have the infrastructure to be able to do so. So Bentero was a part of a study a few years back, I want to say about 10 years ago. It was called Families First Edmonton. And so in that research, we were looking at 4 different types of groups where we were supporting families with, well, of course, one was the control group where we weren't doing anything different. One, we were providing like one-on-one supports to the family about things that they needed to be connected with in order to be, in order to thrive or feel connected and a part of society. Another one was recreation. By providing families with recreational opportunities, we wanted to see if that made a difference. And then, of course, the 4th group was both family supports and connecting them to recreation opportunities. And we learned all kinds of things. It was a longitudinal study. It was 5 years long. And we are still, even though it's old data, we're still kind of looking at it. The other neat thing about the timing of that research was we were in a boom cycle right when the research started. And it was really interesting what we learned with families who are struggling, living in poverty, isolated, not connected, and all those things, that the boom just sort of heightened that sense. The gap grew larger. But in one of the ways we sliced the data, I'll never forget it, it was around immigrant and newcomer communities. And although they started at the same sort of place in all of these domains that we were measuring, after 5 years, there was an increase for immigrant and new Canadian families in how they were connected and thriving and doing better economically in all of these certain areas. And Indigenous people remained the same. They didn't quite change over time. And I just think that speaks a lot about how important this engagement is for people and being included, and all of those things that we want to talk about. For Indigenous people, our community is often cut off from these opportunities because of lack of capacity. This is what we hear from people who engage with our organizations around how do we support our Indigenous folks that are coming to our organization or our institution. Lack of capacity, frankly, a lack of willingness, and a lack of knowledge of how to support. And this is This is what we often hear, and the struggle that we have with that, and why we're always open to supporting others in this work, is that for Indigenous people, this is their land, this is their country of origin, and so it really is a responsibility we have to make sure that those worldviews are considered, and that policies, regulations, programs are built with those things in mind. Um, when you look here in Edmonton, and I'm sure it's the same in other cities, there are places for the Italian community to gather, for the Chinese community to gather, for all kinds of groups to gather. And there's often not a place for Indigenous people to gather in that same way. So anyway, I'll leave that there. So we worked hard over the past 25 years to develop those relationships. One of the things I'll say about that is that our um, approach was very gentle. So there's a lot of not really good history of Indigenous people in this land. People learned a lot about it when the TRC started having their gatherings across Canada. I think there were 7 gatherings, and Edmonton was the last gathering. And one of the things I found that gathering did was it really opened the door for people to be curious, for people to ask questions, for people to start conversations about this part in our history, about how we are looking at our organizations and how they are helping or not helping, and to really question our practice and our methodologies in our organizations. And because I think of the size of our organization, I think because we've always been willing to be collaborators in this work, our phone rang off the hook, and it continues to do so. We're really sought after. And I'm not trying to boast, I'm just saying that I think one of the reasons that people engage with us is because we have been committed to be gentle teachers and very patient teachers when it comes to this work, because it's really important. And if someone who's trying to learn more gets shamed or harshly corrected or something like that along the way, it could really stop a really important conversation from continuing. And so I'm not saying we're just all nice all the time, but when things are maybe getting stuck, all of that, we will of course speak up and talk about the importance of looking at the work from a different angle. But we are always committed to being kind, gentle, and patient teachers here. And we've been around for 25 years. I've been around for 25 years with this organization. I came here right after school, and I can say with all honesty that the world is not the same world it was when I started here. So there's a lot of things that are different. So I know progress is happening, and I think the sustainability is something that you want to happen slow and gradual. So what else am I going to say? Oh, so one of the really big changes that happened in our organization after the TRC, lots of conversations were happening, and really like simple, basic conversations. I remember having a conversation with the library here in town, and they were talking about engaging with the Indigenous community and feeling like they weren't getting it right, acknowledging that the largest group that they were seeing in their space was Indigenous people, but also the largest number of people that they were banning or kicking out of their buildings were Indigenous people as well. But they came to us very humbly to say, we know these 2 stats don't look good, but we want that to change. And I talked about something as very basic as having ceremony in their space, and acknowledging that this space is for everybody, having Indigenous people there when that ceremony happens, and We do it in our space. We cleanse our building about quarterly every season. And because there's lots of heaviness that can build up if you don't. And one of the things that we do is we hang prayer flags up in our space. And they are a call to people who are visiting here that we pay attention to these sorts of things. And it's also a call to our visitors here that they need to conduct themselves in a certain way when they're in our space. And so just having that real casual conversation with the library about paying attention to these things will make their patrons, their Indigenous visitors, be mindful of how they are when they're in that space. And they were just really appreciative to have that real conversation about how they could start that work. And the conversation continues. Another thing that happened is that we do a lot of work with Children's Services, and in Children's Services, we used to work with them in a very different way. We were a contracted agency that was contracted to provide very specific services to parents and youth and children. And the work was really piecemealed out. And in 2012, we got a contract for a new service delivery model called collaborative service delivery. In Alberta, our Indigenous people make up almost 70% of the caseloads for children's services, so very overrepresented, as they are in most provinces and in the territories. But this collaborative service delivery model allowed us to have control over the finances that were needed to provide the families with all those different services. So we were able to provide any and all of the services that were required. And for the ones that we didn't have the infrastructure or the ability to provide, we could outsource those services. And just putting that in our hands really changed the conversation, because our CFS workers couldn't just order these services anymore. They had to have a conversation with us because we held the funds. And so we really started having some really good dialogue about what was that service needed for and how was it going to benefit this family. And it also allowed for a greater conversation amongst all the service providers, because we were the coordinator of that. And we were no longer tied to specific line items, and had ability to be innovative and creative and move things around to meet the needs of families that we were serving. One family that I will never forget was a family that came to us because there was threats of domestic violence in the home from the father, who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And whenever his meds went off, he became very unstable and very threatening to his family. And I just remember them very honestly meeting with us and having this conversation about how he acknowledged that he was scaring his family, but he just didn't have the finances to leave. And so this funding model allowed us to help this dad get a place to leave, and nothing bad had to happen. Like, so no family violence incident had to happen where he hurt or threatened to hurt his wife and children. And but in the old way of doing things, that's exactly what would have had to happen, and then everybody would have came in to try and help. But that just adds trauma, right? So this service delivery model has been a real game changer here in how we are serving the folks that we're serving in that system. And because we're not tied to line items, we were able to create opportunities for people to gather. And those are really important for that sense of connectivity, that sense of belonging that Indigenous people are really looking for when they're disconnected from their home communities. So we have things like powwow nights here, we have sewing and beading nights, we have ceremonies going on all the time. We're taking people out on the land to harvest medicines and berries and learning about those things. So There's just like so many opportunities we got out of that. And our funder was okay knowing that maybe, I don't know, 70 of the people who came to Powwow Night are in that program that they're funding, but 100 ears can hear that drum and still get the benefit from it. And they were okay with us just opening the doors to community. So we didn't have to check anybody to see if they were connected to that program. We just opened the doors for folks to come in. So we're continuing to evolve. We're by no means there. We just keep looking at our work and looking at ways that we can do better. And one of the areas that we've evolved in is helping our colleagues in this same area look at their collective practice. We're seeing some really good statistics come out of that work. But now that kids are with family, poverty becomes a really important conversation. We want people to feel like, or to have the resources that they need to be able to care for their children in their family homes and such. So we support our colleagues in community with their practice and their engagement of Indigenous children, youth, and families, whatever service it is that they're providing. We also, about 5 years ago, came together with 4 other organizations here in Edmonton, and they are Terra Center for Teen Parents, Norwood Child and Family Resource Center, Edmonton Mennonite Center for Newcomers, and Boyle Street Community Services. And those are very different, diverse organizations that serve a very certain group of people here in the city of Edmonton. And then we're the 5th. We call ourselves the C5, and we initially came together because we wanted to collaborate for change. We did a look at who we're serving and found that 5 years ago we were serving about 30,000 people collectively, and we wanted to be a voice for those 30,000 people that we were serving. What we ended up evolving into was, so initially we were meeting with city council, with mayor, with ministers or MLAs or MPs with certain portfolios to talk about certain issues that our community was collectively experiencing. An example of that was around housing regulations and how some housing regulations were really having a negative impact collectively on the people that we were serving, us 5 organizations. And so going to a minister on my own as an organization, they could say that that's an issue for the Indigenous minister or Indigenous community, it's specific to them. But when 5 of us were going saying this regulation is a problem, then it really truly was a problem with the regulation. And we didn't just go with issues, we went with potential for solutions and willing to be a part of coming up with a solution to some of those problematic regulations. The other thing that our partnership evolved into was actual funded initiatives. So we have about 3 or 4 funded initiatives now, and we kept our diversity, so we didn't merge as to become this one big conglomerate. We wanted to maintain our identity and our specific organizations because that was the magic that we brought into the mix. We really were speaking from our cultural lens of our organizations and keeping our community really top of mind. But we were also really doing a lot of cross-pollination and cross-learning and really going down lots of really cool rabbit holes to look at having impact on other areas that we didn't even see from the very beginning. An example of that is with Mennonite Center for Newcomers. We learned that the first gift that Canada gave a lot of these newcomers was that Indigenous people are bad, or some negative narrative about Indigenous people, and don't engage with them, don't talk to them because they're a problem. And we decided to do something about that. And so we do a lot of cross, I don't even want to call it training. It's about cross experiences. It's about our community understanding what newcomers experience and vice versa, and looking at the world through our respective lenses. And it's really been a really uplifting experience, spending that time with each other. It graduated into when newcomers are landing in Edmonton, we will assemble a group of 5 or 6 people. We'll have a Treaty 6 flag. We'll have a gift for a family that is arriving, and we will sing them a welcome song at the Edmonton International Airport. That's our C5 work, embedding it in all parts of our organization. So in our leadership, in our frontline staff, and then even going the other way, we also embedded it in our work with our boards. So all 5 of our boards meet periodically throughout the year to be on top of changes that are going on in our work. And then, of course, I'm the co-chair of Edmonton Poverty and Poverty Edmonton, pardon me. And I've been a part of that work since the mayor started the task force on poverty elimination. So very embedded in that work. And because it's also tied into the work that we're doing, I applied to be on the National Poverty Council. And we just had our first in-person meeting about 2 weeks ago in Ottawa. And so we're looking to inform policies and programs that will directly impact poverty reduction for Canadian families. Our very first meeting, we had a rich discussion on racism, colonialism, and systemic issues that are root causes of poverty. We have a 10-year mandate. My term is only 2 years. So our cohort will develop our terms of reference that will set stage for the work to begin, but also, you know, to keep it alive and going for the next cohort that's going to be coming along. And then that's all I was going to say. I'm sorry I got dropped. I don't know what happened.
That is great. Thanks, Cheryl. It's okay. These things happen when we're live, right?
Yeah.
You never know. Okay, so thanks for sharing. We're gonna open it up to bring Jonathan in.
All right.
Start a discussion.
I'm a little nervous with all the technology stuff, so I too will keep my video off. Cheryl, thank you for all the work that you do. Very inspiring stuff. I have pages of questions here, but we only have 20 minutes. At the beginning of your sharing, you mentioned that there's this desire on building on the strengths of individuals that you're working with to thrive. Is there a way in which you seek to identify those strengths moving forward?
I would say that the strengths people have are that the Indigenous folks that we're seeing in our organization, they're really inherent. And so, but through all kinds of things and things in history and policies along the way, they have eroded some of those strengths that are really inherent in our Indigenous communities, and that is our strong kinship ties, our way of seeing each other as community, as a large community, our interconnectedness with one another. So those are things that we really try to draw out and breathe life into here at our organization, and also in other organizations that are serving our community. We want them to feel as welcome at a City of Edmonton program as they do here.
Another thing I was giving some thought around was the idea of when entering into conversations, and especially around poverty, the very notion of the power dynamics that are present. Mm-hmm. And the way I kind of see power is like in threefold. The first would be kind of the external manifestation of power, which we speak about like legislation work. The second is kind of like the systemic aspects of power, and you did speak of colonialism. I'm thinking here about white privilege and white systems that are in place. That even though there are some that are welcomed into these structures, they are still in place, and addressing that. And then the third aspect of power that I like to emphasize is that internalized aspects, the effect of the systems on people, how individuals like subconsciously learn to believe or accept a societal definition of themselves that is often oppressive. So I know you mentioned like legislative work, and I really like how you're infiltrating different sectors with addressing elements of the systemic. But how would you suggest we work toward this internalized aspect of power? How people are self-defining themselves based on years, decades, centuries of oppression.
So that collaborative service delivery model I spoke of, our funder also gave us extra money to do some research on, they know Bentero is doing something different. They couldn't define what it was. They wanted this research to be able for us to speak about it, because they wanted us to be able to replicate it or try to embed it in the way we were doing our business across our region. And so this research was really great, because one of the things it gave us was our practice model. It was putting in our minds, our hearts, and on paper a way to articulate what it was that we were doing different and what it was. And so I can speak from our organization, of course, and we have some autonomy in how we want our people to practice. But the really cool thing about this practice model is because we were collaborating and doing this work in partnership, it also influenced the work of our CFS partners. So, and there was this expectation from their ministry that we practice, that they learn from our practice, and CFS workers adopt this way of practicing as well. So even though their structure is historically really damaging to our community, we sort of are looking at changing the lens in which they do the work, which really impacts how the families experience the intervention. And I always say that that practice model isn't just for child welfare. If you're a judge, that practice model could influence that. If you're a lawyer, it could influence that. If you're a teacher, it could influence that. It's a really universal way of looking at the work and how we work with one another. And it articulates it very well. And so we have seen a real change, like I mentioned in my presentation about our statistics with Indigenous families. And I would say they could articulate experiencing that work in a very different way as well. So really feeling like the cards are stacked against them from day one, to feeling like they were a true participant in their family, you know, achieving some wellness and some autonomy and all those good things that we want our families to have.
Great. I was thinking about how you mentioned particular dispositions when we engage in dialogue, that idea of being kind, gentle, patient with one another. And I agree with you. There are those moments where we have to engage in those practices. How do we provide space for anger and allowing people to share their experience through that way?
Yeah, I think bringing in ceremony, that's what we do here. We have ceremony all the time, like and many times throughout the day and many different interactions. We don't start any meeting here unless we started in ceremony. We don't even start our day until we have ceremony. And there are so many hard conversations to have. And, you know, I'm not like, we do have times in those spaces, but it's about allowing that honesty to come out, and it's allowing the listener to not internalize that anger as being directed at them, but directed, but really a truth telling of experience and frustration and all of those things. And ceremony just allows people to walk away okay, you know, that they're not adding trauma to their learning or to their experience. So, and it just, like I said, it sounds really simple, but it is really, really effective. But you have to have a knowledgeable facilitator so that the space is created to be safe in that way.
I have, along those lines, in terms of dialogue and the creating of space, I'm giving some thought around social media. And there are many people having these discussions online. And in those spaces, do you think having a dialogue there is beneficial to the cause or detrimental? And if it is beneficial, what are some practices you would suggest people engage in when online?
I think whoever is engaging or trying to engage in that way needs to have a really good sense of themselves and sort of the platform and their role and their limitations even within that platform. I remember a community member really taking issue with one of the things that we had going on here. And, oh, I shouldn't even say that. They really took issue to something that was happening in the community. Just so happened we were involved in that in a very big way. And this person went on social media and said terrible things about this, this thing that was happening in our community, which we were very involved in. And I engaged with them on social media, and we had this whole dialogue. And I think she felt really embarrassed because she didn't realize she was sort of slagging our organization online because we weren't, I don't know, she didn't look at the icons in the corner or whatever, our logo. And once she got over her embarrassment, she really just got honest. But I could have gotten really upset as well. You know what I mean? Like that's where I talk about the really important sense of the opportunity that you have there, and also the limitations, because we could only get so far online. And I actually invited her over to have a bigger conversation about it. And so there's social media, but there's also platforms like this, where if you're far away, you could have conversations, of course, when technology works. You could have conversations face to face about some of these things, but it's good, but there certainly are limitations to it. And then you can't have ceremony the same way as you would if you came into our space or we came into their space.
I like that idea of ceremony and rooting oneself in that before engaging. Can you say a little bit more about what the ceremony looks like?
Sure. One of the things I say about ceremony is that no matter who you are or where you come from, you have been in ceremony before. And so it's that space that we are trying to bring people into, where you suspend judgment, where you have some faith in a process, and there is it's a space where you're just in a different space. And you have to conduct yourself in a certain way in that space. And it's a really true space that you try and create when you're in ceremony. So in our practice model, we likened and created parallels between one of our really sacred ceremonies in our Indigenous communities, which is the Sundance ceremony, and sort of for the purposes of the study, it was our social work practice. And so we created parallels on every element of the Sundance ceremony and how it relates to our practice as helpers, as social workers, working with kids and families involved in the child welfare system. So a Sundance ceremony is someone who, it's a real commitment that they make. And it's not just for the 4 days of that ceremony, but it's for every day in between those ceremonies. And they happen once a year around June usually. And they go without food, water, shelter, all the comforts that we like for 4 days and 4 nights of that ceremony. They dance from sunup until sundown, and they're facing a tree of life in the middle of the arbor that is adorned with all of the prayer flags of all of the people who are there for that ceremony. And and in some tribes, you sacrifice flesh as well. So they'll pierce their skins until they break free from that piercing. And so they're sacrificing flesh as well. They're doing this ceremony for their own reasons, for sure, but they're also doing it for the good of people they don't even know. And so in our analogy, we are comparing those sun dancers themselves to the moms and dads that we work with in our child welfare system. So you can appreciate the different worldview from Western social work, which looks at these parents as having an issue we need to resolve, right? It's a deficit-based model. Mm-hmm. And in our Sundance analogy, our sun dancers are held in a place of honor because they're sacrificing for the good of others, right? So that comparison alone helps us look at the work in a really different way. The prayer flags represent our hopes and dreams and wishes of things that we want or things to be different or guidance on a journey. Those represent in our practice our service plans. So we have service plans that talk about those same things. In our Sundance analogy, it's the prayer flags. In the Sundance analogy, you have a stick man who has a very important function in that ceremony, and that is to not let the sun dancers give up. They motivate these sun dancers throughout those 4 days to keep dancing and keep praying, constantly praying for the things that people are there to seek help with. And in our Western model, those are our practitioners. Those stick men are our practitioners. They're telling our moms and dads to not give up, to keep dancing. And in child welfare, even though it's called child welfare, in Western child welfare, we keep children out of that scenario because we're trying to protect them, right? But they're living it. They know what's going on. And in our Sundance analogy, we bring our children to these ceremonies. So we don't shelter them from that. And there's learning that happens in that. And I mean, I could go on and on and on, but that is the way that that's what our practice model is. And we call it practice as ceremony. And so we are trying to achieve a practice here in our organization as if you're in ceremony, because it creates a really real space between you and the family, the child, the youth, whoever it is that you're serving. It creates a real true space for you to be able to begin that work together. We do like half-day, day-long trainings on this model.
Great. I'm just going to come up for air a little bit. Is there any questions from the viewers here that you'd like to?
Well, I'm looking at the chat box. There's a lot of comments in this chat box. So really great, really interesting, interesting information being shared, and some questions. I think some of these can be great as follow-up, but I'm going to flag just a couple because we only have a few minutes left, and hopefully we're able to follow up with some of the other ones. Here's one. So how do you make sure that those who might be triggered from the spaces, I think this is really around providing a safe space, but how do you make sure that that space is safe for people who may be triggered?
Mm-hmm. So there's I look at that question in two ways. One way I look at it is if another organization is coming for assistance in how to engage, and wanting to do that in a really authentic and meaningful way, and they come making suggestions of maybe making the wrong suggestions, just that we are committed to being a safe space for them to ask those questions. I think one of the things that stops people is that they're worried they're going to make a mistake or really cross some kind of cultural boundary, and they don't want to do that. And so we just make it really safe for our people that we're serving, to, if they get triggered and become really angry. Like I keep talking about our ceremony, our medicines that we use really help in that regulation of people when they're in that space. And then having our supports in the room with us to assist people if they're triggered in that way. So, and then we prepare facilitators on how to take that on, how to manage that if it happens in a group setting or anything like that. So we just try to be mindful ahead of time, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, great, Cheryl. I'm going to pose one more question before we finish up. There's a common theme. There's a few of these questions that are asking about just a little bit more information about the C5. So how it works and whether Indigenous ways of knowing and doing are guiding the work of C5.
Yes, they are. Always. So we are always talking about how we're working together. We are not a silent partner in the 5 organizations, so we have a really big voice because one of the things that, aside from the Mennonite Center for Newcomers, we're all serving Indigenous people in some manner, and so it is very present. They have their own website as well, so if you look up for C5 on your search engine, they have their own website if you want to learn more.
Great. I really there's such good questions. I don't want to lose them. So I'm going to throw one or two back at you before we wrap up. So any toolbox available with strategies for facilitators?
Well, there is training that we do, which would put tools in your toolbox for sure. So we do training at our organization for our staff and others organizations around how to facilitate a circle process, how to use ceremony in your process in your sites. So we do for sure have those opportunities here anyway. So.
Great, and we can provide some links as well, some follow-up information.
Yeah, if you go on our
resources.
website, Practices Ceremony has its own tab on our website, and those training opportunities are listed on there.
Great, and I know we might not have time for this, but let's give it a go. Last question, how are people with lived experience involved in what you do other than as clients?
Well, I would say if you're Indigenous, you have lived experience, and a good number of our staff here are Indigenous, and so I just think, when you're Indigenous, you have lived experience, and so they're absolutely involved, and our people have a really big voice in this organization. So short answer is yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, we will move into, it looks like we don't have much time for any other questions, but some of these, we will save everything that's in this chat box, and we will package this up as a follow-up to everyone with some great links. I see there's some really great housing resources as well. That are being shared here. So we will follow up with everyone on everything that's in the chat box. So on wrapping up, we just wanted to share with you a Tamarack resource on respectful engagement resource library. And here you will find links to several resources. One of them is actually the Indigenous Circle First Voice Inclusion and Participation Equity Protocol, and that's from Edmonton. And also our guide to engaging people with lived and living experience. And that is a resource that shares stories from 10 different communities across Canada. So you can find lots of links to resources through that link there.